Welcome to Live at the Public Square. I am JJ Clark, the Marketplace Theologian, and I create spaces for conversations on theology, leadership, and formation that often fall in the gap between the church and the marketplace. Today, I want to talk to you about something that sits very close to leadership, but often hides behind language that sounds mature, responsible, strategic, or even spiritual. I want to talk about control, more specifically, the moments when control looks like wisdom. I've named today's live The Hidden Posture of Control, how control hides behind spirituality and strategy in the church and the marketplace. Heads up, this topic can feel confronting, but that is exactly why it's worth covering. Now, many of us are familiar with control. We've probably experienced it relationally. We've probably forgiven someone who tried to control us. We've walked away from a leader or partner who couldn't let go of a decision or an expectation. We know what that looks like. And most of us have made peace with not wanting to be that person. But I'm not talking about that version of control today. There are two main postures of control. Posture one is control over people. That's the intimidation, micromanagement, manipulation, refusing to let someone else have agency. Posture two is control over ownership of outcomes. That is trying to manage certainty. It's about trying to own a picture of your future or a response, a result, things that only God can govern. That's the version that we are focusing on today, the one that's often running quietly in the background of our lives because it doesn't look like control. It looks like diligence. It looks like discernment. It looks like faith. Here's what I mean. In the marketplace, this version sounds like strategy, excellence, even due diligence, protecting the brand. In the church, it sounds like the peacekeeper, submission, waiting on God, standing on Bible. Few of us would ever want to describe our testimony as one of control, but plenty of us have built one. We've built a testimony of control around being thorough, being careful, being prayerful, uh, being prepared, without ever asking what that carefulness or preparedness was actually trying to protect us from. Well, that's the conversation today. The posture that holds control as a virtue and has been doing so for so long that many of us have stopped being able to see the difference. There's going to be a reframe of what control actually is. So we're focusing on mainly control as the attempt to secure an outcome that's outside of our lane. There are levels of responsibility that absolutely belong to us, like our obedience, our preparation, our integrity, our honesty, our willingness to have the hard conversations or set those boundaries and enforce them. Those things are ours to hold, they're our responsibilities. And actually, carrying those things well is good stewardship. But there are other things which fall under sovereignty. They aren't ours. We don't govern how people receive us. We don't govern whether the room understands us. We don't govern whether the boundary is welcomed or accepted, or whether obedience protects us from consequences that we're afraid of. We can influence those things through our wisdom and through our faithfulness, but we cannot secure them and we cannot have ownership of them. Nobody can, at least no human can. Control begins exactly at the point where we as leaders stop stewarding what's ours and start trying to guarantee what isn't ours to guarantee. And the thing that makes this difficult to catch is often it's nothing to do with behavior. Often behavior doesn't have to change. Often it's the motive that must change. And actually, when we change the motive, if the behavior does need to change, it changes naturally. Seeking counsel because you're humble or because you need counsel looks identical to seeking counsel because you want someone else to absorb the risk of the decision. Another example, delaying because the timing genuinely matters looks identical to delaying because you're not ready to give up or pay what obedience is asking. Do you see that there's the same behavior, the same language, but there are different postures, and posture asks different questions. So wisdom asks the question, what is faithful here? And control asks the question, how do I make this safe for me? That's the whole test. Like everything I'm about to show you onwards from here is about that question. And actually, this is something that's really important for you to know. There is a reason control is so hard to catch in ourselves. And it isn't just because it's psychology, but it is because we treat it as if it's only psychology. See, the reason control is so hard to catch in ourselves is about theology, but the theology side gets missed all the time, even though it's deeply formative. Now, control asks us to hold three things that are not ours to hold. Number one, control asks us to be omniscient, to know enough, to predict enough, to read every room, and to see far enough ahead that the pain becomes avoidable. And that's where we have the thoughts, I should have known. Omniscient. Control asks us to be omnipotent. This is to have enough power to make people respond how we want them to respond, to be able to make the plan succeed and to make the outcome safe. That's where the thoughts come up where we know we need to have a conversation with someone, and so we start rehearsing the conversation in advance. And we say things like, if I say it this way, they'll respond the way I need them to. Or if I get it wrong, then I'll lose control of the situation. So I need to get the wording right, and then I can control how they take it or how it lands. Control asks us also to be omnipresent, everywhere at once, managing every conversation, every reaction, every possible misunderstanding before it happens. That is what drives us when we get into that state of over-explaining, that constant check-in, the unnecessary follow-up, and the urge to insert ourselves into rooms or conversations we do not actually need to be in, just to make sure that nothing happens without us managing the narrative or the situation. Now, that is what I call borrowed sovereignty. And when we are trying to carry omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence while still praying, quoting scripture, and using all the right spiritual language, there is a name for what's happening underneath. And you're not going to like it. And neither did I. But you can blame Parker J. Palmer for this one. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, in the chapter called Leading from Within, he popularized the phrase functional atheism in Christian leadership. It describes a hidden leadership shadow that is a belief that the ultimate responsibility for everything rests with us. So, in plain terms, a person can believe in God, pray, quote scripture, and use all the right terminologies and language, but functionally, they live, they lead, they plan, they strive, they control, and they carry outcomes as though God is absent or inactive. It's a professed faith running alongside a practical unbelief. Much of what we call control is functional atheism, wearing spiritual language. It's why there are so many times when we might intellectually believe God is sovereign, but we're living as though everything ultimately depends on us. Functional atheism doesn't mean that someone is denying God with their mouth. It means they confess belief in him, but while they're living their life like it's absent or unreliable. So they're saying one thing, but their life is showing something else. Maybe they believe in him and confess that belief, but is simply just too slow to be trusted with the outcome. So they just got to manufacture the outcomes themselves. In all honesty, I don't know about you, but I can definitely say that I've experienced that, where I've been there. We can say that God is sovereign and still lead every meeting as though everything depends on our ability to manage everything. We can say that God can be trusted and still make every decision as though uncertainty is unbearable unless we personally control it. I literally just had a meeting with my spiritual director on the same point. So this is something that I don't know if you ever nail it, but in certain points in your life, it can run away with you. And you always need to make sure you know how to get back. It's this contradiction that we slip into, especially in moments of high stress or crisis. This contradiction that, yeah, I believe in God and I'm a believer and God is my CEO and all of those things. Yet we plan within an inch of our life as if we don't control this outcome, it's not going to work in our favor, as if we even have the power to control outcomes. But the way we overthink, the way we overplan, the way we overprepare, it slips into functional atheism. And keep hold of that phrase that I shared earlier, borrowed sovereignty, because that's what we're going to cover next. One of the clearest biblical pictures of control under pressure is Saul in 1 Samuel 13. Before we get to what Saul does, you need to understand the pressure that he was actually under, because without it, his decision just looks reckless. So Saul is king, but he's not leading from a position of stability. The monarchy is brand new. Israel is still emerging out of the instability of the judges, and were under serious threat. The Philistines were gathering them against them in force, and Saul's own army was small and untested and badly under-equipped. There, this was not a manageable situation. It was a nation staring down at an enemy that it wasn't ready to face. It's not ready for Philistines, not this nation, not yet. Back when Saul was first anointed king, the prophet Samuel had given him specific instructions. Go to Gilgal, wait there 7 days, and I will come. And when I come, I will offer the burnt offering and the peace offering myself and seek God's direction. And only then, you will know what to do next, right? So this is the prophet Samuel giving instructions to King Saul. See, it was how a king in the culture back then sought the Lord before going to battle. Before Israel moved against an enemy, they needed God's favor and God's direction. And the burnt offering was how they asked for that. It was the moment where the army stopped and said, in effect, we are not going to fight this battle on our own, in our own strength. We need the Lord to go before us. And without it, going to war would have meant marching out presumptuously, trusting their own numbers and their own weapons, rather than trusting God with the outcome. Everything seems right? But Samuel was late. Saul is now panicking. His entire assignment in this moment is to wait, but every hour that Samuel doesn't show up, more of Saul's army are disappearing. All he can see is his authority, which is brand new and completely untested, but right now it's dissolving in front of him. This is a king watching his own credibility evaporate while being obedient and waiting. Then we turn to 1 Samuel 13, 8-9, and it says, Then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, Bring a burnt offering and a peace offering here to me. And he offered the burnt offering. Okay. Saul was not wrong about the danger he was in. The threat, the fear, the instability, all of that was real. It was all happening. There's definitely a crisis. But that didn't matter, because the king could lead the army, but he had no authority to be the one who approached God on the nation's behalf. That belonged to the prophet and priestly office. So the sequence mattered enormously. Wait for Samuel, let Samuel seek the Lord, then move once direction has been given. And that's exactly why this story matters for you and me. Saul's failure was that he allowed the risk and the pressure that he was under to become louder than the instruction that he had already received. He crossed the line that wasn't his to cross. He didn't stop believing in God, not that it says in scripture, but because he stopped believing that God would hold the outcome, he decided to take the next step. That is functional atheism. It's what it looks like in real time. It says, God may be real, but this situation needs me to secure it. And we didn't see in scripture that Saul renounced the Lord at Gilgal. He just tried to secure an outcome that wasn't his to secure. He borrowed sovereignty. And in a crisis, just think a moment how that might have looked to the people around him. I'm sure it looked like he was just being decisive. He was doing what he needed to do. But when Samuel finally arrives, there was no credit given for that decisive move. It says in scripture, 1 Samuel 13, 13 to 14. And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue." You see, there's something else I want to explain here. Pressure did not create the posture in Saul, it revealed it. Something had already taught him that waiting was dangerous long before Gilgal. Maybe it was past disappointment or rejection, fear of looking weak. Maybe there was a season where trusting someone else cost him before. The crisis that he was under didn't plant the belief, it applied enough weight, enough pressure to make it visible, to make the posture of control visible. And that's what pressure does to all of us. It doesn't introduce something new, it reveals or shows us what we already believe about what's going to happen if we have to wait, or what's going to happen if this goes a different way to what we've planned. In Saul's scenario, maybe there's the fear of losing his credibility and looking weak in front of the people, that he was supposed to be leading. And maybe that fear of looking weak and losing his credibility was stronger than his obedience in that moment. It took a crisis to show him and everyone else where he is actually going to be loyal to the fear or to the obedience. And it's the same questions that we often have to ask ourselves. Let's talk a moment about where this posture of control hides in the church. I'm going to share an example, something that I saw recently. You might not understand immediately where the control comes in, but humor me, okay? So, like I said, it's harder to see the posture of control in church because often it's dressed up in scripture. But the posture of control is more common than you think. I recently saw this play out when I saw this video. A woman was in a long distance marriage with a man who lives in a different country. There's like 20 years age difference. She sends him money every month, but they don't see each other. I'm setting the scene briefly because the story really isn't the point, but it helps to, show the clarity over the point. So she brings her marriage situation to a panel to discuss and get some answers and some ideas and thoughts. And from what it sounded like, to get permission. But as she's explaining her situation, everybody believed, or it sounded like, that she was in some sort of sham marriage. And the way as she went on, the more and more it sounded like she'd been duped. So as she went on, she told everyone about how, she's paying this husband every month and she doesn't see him. And she was asking herself the question about, is it worth fighting for this marriage? The thing is, it sounded like she was being, or potentially being, financially exploited, maybe even drawn into enabling what may be a fraudulent activity. But she decided that she was staying in the relationship for what she believed to be on account of her faith. So she's a believer, And she said she was staying because of a part of scripture that she recited from Proverbs 31. And that scripture was, she does him good and not evil all the days of her life. Not even the full verse, but just that little bit. And she's using that to hold on to, that fragmented part of scripture without any context, and using it to justify not just staying in the relationship, but potentially enabling what may have been fraudulent activity without even questioning it. And as I heard this, I thought immediately, this is dangerous. It's dangerous to hold on to one part of scripture while disconnecting it from the full picture, from context. She does him good and not evil isn't there to justify ignoring evidence or abandon your own discernment. The full scripture, the full verse in Proverbs 31, verse 11 to 12, it says, the heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. And then it moves on to Proverbs 31:16. And let's just hear how this woman sounds. She considers a field and buys it. From her profits, she plants a vineyard. So, Proverbs 31 doesn't present a naive woman. It presents a discerning, capable, economically wise woman, someone who evaluates before she invests, who stewards what's given to her, who prepares for the future. Doing someone good doesn't mean enabling fraud or deception or financial exploitation. Sometimes good looks like telling the truth. It looks like holding a boundary. It looks like seeking wise counsel. It looks like pausing financial support until there's accountability on both sides. Now, here's where this is going to connect back to what I just told you about Saul, right? About control. It isn't just a story about reading the Bible badly. See, I want you to notice what she was actually doing with the verse. She wasn't just misreading scripture, she was using it to secure an outcome. That outcome was to stay married because that felt safer than the alternative. Because the alternative is what? It's shame, rejection, loneliness. The reality of being single again and having to publicly admit that she was wrong about this whole relationship that she actually got married into. That verse or partial verse gave her a spiritually respectable reason to avoid all of that. It let her call, her idea of staying in marriage, it let her call it obedience. When what was really happening was she was managing her own fear of what truth would cost her. Do you see the similarity? Because this is the exact same mechanism as Saul at Gilgal. Different fear, different outcome, same posture. Fear became more authoritative than the instruction, and scripture or anything else. We can use all of these things to make us sound obedient and spiritual. We literally can use scripture to make fear sound like faith. And we have to ask, what role is the church playing in her life, in our life, where we get to a point where we are holding on to verses that don't tell the full story because we haven't done the backstory, we haven't looked at the context. What are we allowing church to do in our life? Are we actually seeking wise counsel? Or are we seeking counsel that will allow us to continue staying in a posture of control? One thing I will say is it's so important to really understand scripture the best we can, obviously. But biblical literacy is important because it protects us. Sometimes it protects us from ourselves because a verse that's handled without its context can be turned into whatever we most need it to say, and that becomes dangerous. So that's an example of how control, a posture of control, can hide in the church or with scripture. So let me share some examples of how it hides or where it hides in the marketplace. Because the same posture shows up in business. It just wears different language to the church. That's all. Marketplace leadership trains you to measure, revenue, engagement, conversion, retention, reach, all of those things, right? None of that is the problem. Refusing to look closely at results will eventually damage the work that you're trying to protect. So it's important, actually, that we do learn how to measure these things. But the problem starts when the measurement stops being information and becomes identity. When the numbers stop telling you what happens and starts telling you who you are. Here's what that can do to any of us. If the launch becomes proof of legitimacy, we'll try to control every variable of that launch because the launch is no longer just a launch. The launch is a verdict on our character and identity. If client retention becomes proof of worth, we will over deliver in ways that will bankrupt our own capacity and train our clients to need us more than is healthy on either side. If visibility becomes proof of calling, we'll start shaping our obedience around whatever platforms rather than around what's true. That is control wearing the clothing, the disguise of excellence. It sounds like I'm just trying to build sustainably. It sounds like I'm protecting the brand. But underneath, we may be trying to secure something that the metric can't give us. Our own sense of legitimacy or safety or calling. This is borrowed sovereignty again. It confesses that God is the source, then treats revenue as the actual security. It confesses calling, then treats engagement as the real validation. You can have good numbers and still be governed entirely by fear. This is why marketplace leaders need theology, not just strategy. Strategy plans and improves the plan, but theology asks the harder questions, like whether the plan has become the thing that you're actually trusting to save you. Okay, so I want to turn this into a bit more formative conversation because naming a problem without offering the alternative just produces guilt, and guilt doesn't really form us well. So we're going to talk now about what wisdom does when wisdom is brought into the mix. So as leaders, we need to now learn and understand how to make wise decisions. And wisdom, just to be clear, is not the absence of planning. It's planning held in a different posture to the one that we've already spoken about. Miles Monroe said planning is the highest form of faith, and I agree with him. Preparing well, structuring the offers, counting the cost, reviewing our numbers, all of these things are not actions that show unbelief. We're not saying that these things are bad, and by doing them, you have no faith. These actions actually show good stewardship. In fact, poor preparation is often dressed up as faith or being spirit led, but it's actually negligent and it's wrapped in with this churchianity branding. So it gets you off the hook from making a decision. Planning is good, it's important to plan, but planning stops serving faith the moment you start using it to remove the need for faith. Let me say that again. Planning stops serving faith the moment you start using planning to remove the need for faith. Proverbs holds this tension for us with more precision than we usually give it credit for. And that is Proverbs 16, verse 3, where it says, "Commit your works to the Lord, and your thoughts will be established." And then as we move on a bit further to Proverbs 16:9, it says, "A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps." When you read them two together, the two verses put planning inside of dependence on the Lord, inside. So you may bring your work, your preparation, your strategy all before God. You plan, you act, and your best laid plans remain under His governance, because what you do isn't the thing that ultimately secures the outcome in the first place. James 4:13 to 15 sharpens this, where he says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit, whereas you don't know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that." And it's important to recognize this. James isn't rebuking them for having a plan. He's rebuking the posture behind their behavior, which was speaking about the future as though it's already theirs. They've already secured it. And this is where the doctrine of providence becomes, I think, one of the most freeing things that we can actually understand. Providence gives us language for responsibility without sovereignty. Providence in classical Christian theology is the doctrine that God doesn't just create the world and step back. He continues to sustain it, govern it, and work within it in the ordinary events of our lives as much as in the extraordinary events of our lives. It's the answer to the question every leader eventually asks, even if it's never phrased in the same way, but it's asked, and that is anyone actually holding this, or is it just me? Am I the only one holding this together? Is anybody actually controlling this situation, or is it just me? Is it all under my control? There's a theologian called David Ferguson, and he's written extensively on this, and he's got a book called The Providence of God, a Polyphonic Approach. And his word for it is really deliberate. Polyphonic means many voices, many instruments playing together rather than one dominating melody line. Ferguson here resists two easy but wrong pictures of providence. One picture says, God controls every detail like a puppeteer and leaves no room for our choices, for our preparation, for our responsibility to mean anything. And the other picture says, God is basically absent, and everything that happens is down to us, our effort, our strategy, our management. And so Ferguson here, um, with his polyphonic view, says something that's more honest than either of those pictures. He says, God is genuinely active and involved, and our choices are genuinely real and consequential. And both of these things are true at the same time, without one canceling the other. And that's why providence gives us language for responsibility without sovereignty. We are not powerless, and Christian leadership doesn't require us to be passive, but we are not sovereign. We do not govern timing or response or reception or outcome. We can influence these things through wisdom and integrity, but we cannot secure a single one of them. We can steward, we cannot save. We can obey, we cannot control what obedience will produce. That distinction is not there to frustrate us. It's an act of mercy. It shows us God's character. Because what's the alternative? The alternative, the one that Saul chose at Gilgal and that the woman chose using half a verse. It's trying to carry a future with our own hands that we're just not built to carry. It will crush us. Having the power to do all of these things and the foresight, the omniscience, and all of the, if that will crush us, just like it crushes everybody else who tries. And so, where does this leave us? Everything that we've talked through around Saul, this woman, the metrics, the plan, it comes down to one distinction, and it's not always visible from the outside. And that is control and diligence can look completely identical from the outside. Prayer and delay can sound completely identical from the outside. Peace and avoidance can sound completely identical from the outside. The only thing that ever tells them apart is the question running underneath the behavior, which is, are you asking what's faithful, or are you asking how to make this safe? When we are taking actions, when we're delaying, when we're pausing, when we're running ahead, what is it that's driving us? Is it the question about faithfulness, or is it a fear that we're trying to avoid or create, manufacture a safety net? Everything that we've talked about already today, they're all very different. The plans, the metrics, woman, the soul, all of that, very different. But like I said, it's all the same question. It's all the same question. And it's important that we learn to recognize it. So I want you to just take a moment and think about a decision in your life. Maybe something you're sitting with right now. Maybe something you've been mulling over, maybe procrastinating over. And I'm going to ask you to ask yourself 3 questions. Question number 1, am I preparing, or am I trying to guarantee an outcome? Question number 2, am I waiting on God, or am I avoiding what's already clear because I'm afraid of what it's going to cost me? Question 3, is what I'm calling faithfulness actually producing freedom, or is it producing more fear, more control, more managing? These are 3 questions that's going to be really useful for you to help you make sure that you are not operating with a posture of control. And just to wrap everything up with a nice bow, I want to make it really clear that you don't need to stop planning or stop preparing or stop seeking wisdom. That would be unwise. Responsibilities and decisions still matter. They still carry a huge amount of weight. And as leaders, in fact, that will never stop being true Our responsibilities and decisions will always be needed from us. But you may need to stop asking your planning or your plans or your strategy to give you sovereignty. You may need to stop letting scripture or the desire for peace of doing the job of avoiding truth. Control can become functional atheism wearing leadership clothing. It confesses that God is sovereign and then leads everything as though everything depends on your human management. It says God can be trusted and then treats uncertainty like it's a threat that has to be eliminated. But I want you to, throughout this week, prepare well, count the cost, obey what has been revealed to you, and then hand back everything that isn't yours to hold. Let me leave you with the final question that we started with. What am I trying to secure that's outside of my lane? Think about it. Think about those other questions that I gave you. And thank you for being here with me, JJ Clark, live at the public square. And I'll see you again next time.